Now, Iraq became a bit of a puzzle in this, because Iraq's a flat area, it's very fertile, and in agricultural societies, Iraq was fought over many, many times, principally by the Persians and the Ottomans. And finally, it was stabilized by the Ottomans for about 400 years under Sunni rule. And then the British decided, after the First World War, let's put another king in there, so they put the Hashemite kingdom in there, and we'll come to that in a minute. And that was also Sunni rule. Don't forget, this is a country which is predominantly Shia. And after the monarchy was kicked out by the nationalist dictatorship, it was still Sunni rule. Only after 2003 did Shia politicians have any power whatsoever in Iraq. And it's an inevitable consequence that since they're the majority, if you want to have democracy in Iraq, it's going to be a Shia-dominated government, which upsets Saudi Arabia. Now, the last piece of this history is to do with Saudi Arabia. So this is looking at the Sunni, I was going to say the sunny side of the street, but it's just too pat, isn't it? There's some words here, some definitions really. Salafis. What the hell are Salafis? Religious fundamentalism is not unknown to the United States. It's not unknown in Europe. You know, religious fundamentalism is on the rise. Not surprisingly, it was on the rise in Saudi Arabia some time ago. Now, Salafis think the early period of Islam is what we should be emulating. Okay, Semtex wasn't invented then, but never mind. They also think that the whole of Saudi Arabia and Islamic should be purified of Western influence. What someone called West toxification. It's a great name. They have a tendency to extremism. And most Salafis would consider Shia Muslims to be apostates, which is worse than being an infidel. An apostate, you can take all his property away and kill him and it's okay. And there are some Salafi clerics in Saudi Arabia who publicly announce this sort of practice all the time. Another name to remember is Wahhabism. It's often conflated with Salafism, and it's the same sort of thing, but Wahhabism is a name we have given to this particular branch of Islam, and it stems from the early days in Saudi Arabia when the House of Saud, which currently rules Saudi Arabia, had its first state in the 18th century. They teamed up with a guy called Muhammad bin Wahhab, who was a fundamentalist preacher, and the first Saudi Arabian kingdom was created. They are Salafis, and they call themselves Salafis or fundamentalists. The Muslim Brotherhood is a completely different thing. This was created in Egypt in 1928, and they're also fundamentalists, and officially they oppose violence. And what is jihad? Jihadis have sort of heard all this. This is one of the religious duties of a Muslim, and it just means struggle. It could be struggle with yourself, it could be struggle against, temptation, and it can also be struggle against an external enemy, which tends to be what we call it now, unfortunately. Right, we're almost at the end of this little introduction. Middle East, people everywhere are the same, in my experience. I lived across the world most of my life, and people are pretty much the same. But they're organized in different ways. And it's the organizations which create the differences. In the organizations in the Middle Eastern world are to do with much closer loyalties to family, tribe, sect, ethnicity than we do. So there's a difference. And they have a reaction to modernity. Modernity challenges them. They haven't done well since the 18th century. And with the exception of Iran, and I was going to say Yemen, but Yemen's a bit of an odd case, but with the exception of Iran, there's not a single country in the Middle East, Persian Gulf area, which wasn't created in 1920 by the British. Demographics, often a forgotten thing in the Middle East. When the oil well started to flow, people had a lot more children, and the children lived a lot longer. They survived. So 10, 12, 13 children, not unusual. So this huge population explosion took place in the 70s and 80s. Across the Arab world, from the Maghreb in North Africa to the Persian Gulf, and Pakistan as well. And this is what created what I would call a jihadi bulge. This is angry young men. Now if you want a revolution, the first thing you have to do is have lots of angry young men. That's, that's a prerequisite. And angry young men who are also sexually frustrated because they're not allowed to meet women. I mean, this is a combination which just is bad. So, angry young men. The start of the Jihadi bulge, the leading edge of this, just happened to coincide when oil prices were very low. So the Arab rulers didn't have the means to buy social peace. And these people had no jobs, they were unemployed, they had no prospects, they had a sense of righteous indignation. A few leaders came along, jihad. We are slap bang in the middle of what I would call a jihadi bulge right now. In about 10 years' time, this will be over. Some recent history, which we need to remind ourselves of. It's not a happy place, really. The Iranian Revolution, 1979, end of the Cold War, 1990, which triggered all kinds of changes. 9/11, the Iran-Iraq War, an 8-year conflict started by the Iraqis when they invaded Iran after the revolution, thinking, well, Iran's weak, we'll take it. Millions of people died, soldiers and non-combatants. This was then followed by the first Gulf War when Saddam said, well, didn't get Iran, but I'll get Kuwait. So he invaded Kuwait and he was pushed out of Kuwait. Then sanctions on Iraq started. The US started sanctioning Iran in the mid-90s. Soviet-Afghan war went on for a long time. It was a very formative influence for Saudi Arabia because all these young men had a cause. Islamic country has been invaded by the infidel, we must go and liberate it. And the CIA and everyone else pumped a lot of money into this. The Saudi government pumped the most money into it because an awful lot of Saudi youth went over there, led by one of the men who led them was Osama bin Laden. And when he came back, he was a hero. King Fahd put his arm around him, this is our Saudi hero. So, we have to remember these things are fairly recent. And all these guys came back to Saudi Arabia when the Afghan war was over. They were trained. No one wants to give up that lifestyle. Walking around with an RPG and a Kalashnikov in the mountains. It's great. You're a young man. So they came back to Saudi Arabia. What do we do? And this just happened to coincide with this bulge of angry young men. So, not surprisingly, we have a problem. Saudi Arabia has a problem. Now, at the bottom here, you see what I would call spare crude oil production capacity in OPEC. If you turn this upside down, you have the price, pretty much. So from roughly the mid-80s to 2002-03, the price was low. So the capacity for Middle Eastern states to buy their way to peace was limited because it was all going on princes and palaces and other things, but not much left over for the ordinary people. Now what's going on in the future is China has a huge interest in the Middle East, in Iraq, Iran and Saudi Arabia. China has developing its interest very strongly in the Middle East. Which brings us to the balance of power. What's the balance between, is the question. It's between the US and Iran at the moment. Before the revolution, it wasn't, but now it is. Iran has a lot of relationships with Iraq, its co-religionists, we'll come back to that in a minute, and the US has its allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel primarily. Iran and the USA have issues with each other. Some of them go back a long way. For the US, it's the embassy crisis when the hostages were taken. It's Lebanese Hezbollah and its activities in Israel. It's nuclear ambitions, and it's Iraq. But on the other side, the Iranians remember when the CIA ousted their elected prime minister, Mossadegh, in 1951. Why? They thought he was a communist. He wasn't, but they thought he was. The Shah was heavily backed by the US. So when the revolution happened, it wasn't just anti-Shah, it was anti-US. As a consequence. The Iran-Iraq War, 8 years. The US backed Iraq. With military information, logistics, with all kinds of things. There's a resentment about that.